Oh, I see people are joining already. Hello, everyone. We're going to get started in just a couple minutes, but in the meantime, go ahead and tell us in the chat your name and where you're tuning in from. It's always cool to see where people are in the world when they come into these Zooms. And then we'll get started with Rachel in just a couple minutes. All right. Hello, everyone. We're going to get started in just a couple minutes, but in the meantime, go ahead and let us know in the chat where you're tuning in from. And once I see that like the level of participants has kind of leveled out, when it feels like most people are here, we'll go ahead and get started. But go ahead and let us know in the chat where you're tuning in from, and we will get started in just a couple minutes. And while everyone's funneling in, I'll just mention that Rachel's book, Watercolor Botanical Garden, is currently on pre-order on our website. The ebook is available now. And if you registered, you should have gotten a coupon code in your email. We'll send that coupon code to you again tomorrow, along with a link to watch this replay. So if you missed something or you have to leave early, don't worry, you'll get a link and you can watch it again. And then we'll have the print book at the end of July. So if you place that pre-order now, it'll just automatically ship you when it's available.
Also, can I say that if you are local, I'm doing a book signing in Phoenix, so at Changing Hands Phoenix on the 24th of July. So if you guys are local, come out. I'll do a signing and demo there, so that'll be a fun day.
Yeah, it does look like there's a few people in the chat who are tuning in from Arizona, so hopefully they can make it out to your book signing. That'd be really cool.
Oh, look, some people are already saying they're coming. That's so exciting.
All right, well, it looks like it's kind of leveled out. So just a couple things I want to say before I hand it over to Rachel to take us on this watercolor, to start growing our watercolor botanical garden. Thank you all for joining us today. If you signed up, you probably got an email that includes a coupon code. I think it's Botanical40 for Rachel's book, which you can use at Rocky Nook. You can use that on your pre-order, on the ebook, which is available now. But it does only work on rockynook.com. And don't worry if you forgot that coupon code. We'll send you an email tomorrow that includes the coupon code again, and then also a link to watch this webinar replay. So if you miss anything or have to leave early, that'll be in there for you too. And then as we're painting, if you have any questions, go ahead and submit them in the Q&A box, and then we'll get to those at the end and have Rachel answer those for all of us then. So without any more from me, Rachel, I will let you take it over from here.
Awesome. So hi, everybody. Rachel here, Pink Puddle Studio. I am in Phoenix, Arizona, and I saw quite a few of you in Arizona. So thank you, everybody, for being here. Today, we are going to be painting a few lessons from my new book coming out. And the first one that we're going to be starting with is going to be the Dogwood. And then we're going to also then be going on to our prickly pear. So in order for me to paint and just so you guys can see everything better, I'm going to switch my camera over. So you'll be seeing everything downwards and it'll just be all nice and neat for you. So let me just switch my camera really quick. Okay, awesome. Okay, so like I said, I'm really excited that you guys are here today. And I'm just so excited about this book. I have been just really waiting to get into it with you all, and I'm just glad I'd be able to paint with you today. So first, before we start, I'm going to go over our color palette here. So if you guys don't have these colors, don't worry, because all you're doing is looking for colors that are maybe within the same color family or same kind of contrast. So just kind of work with what you have. Okay, so I use multiple kinds of colors. And so we're going to be using these Turner Design gouache, which a lot of people are like, oh, gouache, so you're not a watercolor artist? Well, no, gouache is actually just a very opaque watercolor. And I use these because they're so pigmented. They have a very nice color to them that you can actually use more. There's more in here that you're able to water down, and then you're able to actually have it for a longer period of time just because they're so pigmented. So again, this is the Turner Design Gouache, and I'm going to be using that color starting with the Dogwood Flower. We have our permanent yellow deep here. So if you have kind of like a yellow orange, if you have more of like a lemon yellow, try to maybe mix a little bit of orange into it, or even a tad bit of red to get it to be a little bit warmer. We have our Celadon green here. Okay. This one's a little bit more of like a, I want to say like a muddier, like a cooler, muddier green. And then we have our coral red here. So it's kind of like a little bit of a salmon color. So if you have a pink, that'll work fine. And then right here, I'm also using this Holbein as well. This is a watercolor, and this color is Crimson Lake. So it's kind of like a deeper reddish, like with a purple tint. And I'm going to be mixing that with an aubergine, which is this brand. So again, if you don't have these colors, no problem. Just find more of like a red purple. If you only have red and then you have purple separate, mix some of it together. We're just trying to find the same color family here, okay? And then I have a magenta, and that's from Turner as well, okay? So, and then when we move on to the prickly pear, those again are, you can use any kind of greens, any kind of blues that you have. I just like having a contrast here of, here's a purple, it's a deep purple. Okay, and then here's like a rose, they call it rose madder. So if you have a pink, that works too. If you have a purple, that works. This is an emerald green. So if you have a green, that will work. And then if you have like a blue, that's a little bit lighter, that will work. If you don't have a light blue, you can use, if you have like a turquoise or like a teal, you can use that as well. So just customize it to what you have, and it'll look beautiful as well. So that's a good thing for you too. Like in the book, say you don't have those colors necessarily, even though I tell you in the book all the colors that I use. It's just good to learn how to start mixing colors and utilizing colors that maybe necessarily, if you don't have something, it makes you really a lot better at color theory. So it's good practice for you. Okay, so I'm going to put this off to the side as I'm using it. I'm left-handed, so everything's going to be on my left side over here. If you're right-handed, I'm assuming everything will be on your right. I like to use a little spray bottle like this. So if I put my paint down, or a lot of times I use it in my little wells here like this, and it dries, and then I want to reuse it, I just reactivate it by spraying it with some water. So that's a little tip for you guys. Okay, so I'm just going to spray some of these just so they're not completely dry, but you don't want to really, really over wet them. You just want them a little bit moist, and you can add water as you need. Today, we're going to be using a cold press paper. So there's different kinds of paper when it comes to watercolor. I'll explain everything in my book, so make sure that you look at all the sections as far as materials and things like that when you receive your book. So this is the brand that I'm using today. I also like to use Legion paper. I'll show you what that looks like. So Legion paper, this one is a black, but they have white too. And this is a really good brand for watercolor paper. So watercolor paper, like I said, has different textures. Or cold press, I really like it because I paint more loose and like wet on wet kind of style. And it's just with the texture and the grains, it absorbs really nicely and you get a really good, like I said, texture within your painting. And I really enjoy that because of all the color bleeding that we get. Okay, so let's get started. So I have multiple brushes. In the book, I talk about the types of brushes that I use. I'm going to be using a mix of, say, like a number 8. If you have a number 8 or something close, that will work. These are round brushes. So you're going to want to be using your round brushes. And then you want a smaller one that you can use for detail. So if you have a number 3, a number 2, a number 0, this is like a number 0. Look how tiny that is. Okay. So let's see here. I'm just gonna mix it up, and I'll tell you, if you only have like 1 or 2 brushes, not a problem. Just, again, just use what you have and you can still create something lovely. So I'm gonna start with probably my smaller brush here. So if you have a small brush, let's see, our number 3, let's start with that. If you, again, if you have something that's a little bit smaller, that will work as well. So in the book, oh, you're welcome. Okay. I always find that if I just throw you guys into something, you're just going to get lost really quickly. So I think it's just good to go over a little bit of the basics. So we're going to start out by creating our dogwood flower today. Okay. And like I said, you just use your color palette that is somewhat similar. Like if for some reason you just have red, then make the majority of your dogwood red. And just, like I said, it's good just to learn all your different color mixing and all your variations that you can have. You'll still end up with something very beautiful. Okay, so to get started, you can see in the book that we're going to be starting creating our center. To create these small little dots, what we're going to want to do is use the tip of our brush. So you want to make sure that you get your brush nice and wet. Okay, so a lot of painters, when they're starting, are very dainty with the amount of water and paint that they use. I want you guys to be a little bit more aggressive. Make sure that you get those bristles nice and wet. So just hit it up against the side of your jar here. Awesome. Also, your paper towels are just a great tool. If you have a paper towel, you should get one with you because we're going to have to lift color out of our paintings. Watercolor is all about applying and lifting paint, and you'll see that especially in this specific flower. Okay, so I'm going to start by getting some of the yellow on my brush. Back and forth, back and forth. Notice how I'm not being dainty. I'm not going like this, using the tip. Okay. Okay, so now what I'm going to do is I'm just going to start creating tiny dots like within a circle, but I don't want them to be all the same. So some of them are going to be a little bit bigger, smaller, but I'm just creating my center right now. Okay. So something like this. Now what I want to do is just lightly clean off my brush a little bit. If I'm going to the green, and I'm not super worried about mixing the color in because they're going to be blending in here anyways. So I'm going to grab some of my Celadon green. So whatever green you have, that's a little bit cooler if you have. And then I'm going to go in and I'm going to add some green dots, but I'm not going to completely fill up all of the white space that you see because the white space helps as a highlight. So I'm adding in some green around the area. And some of it's going to bleed a little bit into the yellow, which I like because it gives it that nice blend. Then before everything dries, take a piece of your paper towel and lift the color out from more of the center of the piece. So you're going to get a little bit lighter in this area. It's just going to look a little bit more lifted, and that helps give it a little bit more dimension. Okay. And if you find that like you want your yellow to be a little bit darker on the edges, you can go back in with more yellow and add a bit more. You just, again, never want to completely cover up all that white space that you created because you want it to stay there for your highlight. Okay, so we have our center. Perfect. Now what I'm going to do is switch my brush over to my number. Let's use our number. If you have a number 6 or number 8, pick that up. But if you have something bigger, no problem. You just have to kind of vary the sizing, so the amount of pressure that you put down on your paper, and that'll all make sense in a minute here. So what I'm going to do is load my brush up here. Number 8, got it. Okay, load my brush up with some magenta, but really light. So to make it light, I got to make sure that I add a good amount of water here. back and forth, right? Really get those bristles. Because with watercolor, you want things to be flowy and smooth. And if you don't have the paint within all the bristles, you're going to get a lot of white spots when you're trying to create strokes. So again, I want this color to be lighter, so I'm going to be adding a little bit more water to it. If you want to, off to the side, you can practice creating the shape for your dogwood. So it's going to be kind of like a heart shape. So you can see in the photo here, we're going to use 4 brush strokes, 2 on each one, to create a larger petal. Okay, and it's going to be, like I said, kind of a heart shape. So we're going to make sure that we keep a little bit of white space in between for the little indent. Okay, so off to the side, let's practice. So I'm going to start at the top, pull out with this kind of side of my brush as I'm curving. And then as I'm pulling down, I'm slowly lifting it up. Okay. I'm going to load my brush up a little bit more again, and I'm going to close it off. Go the other way. And then as I'm pulling in, I'm lifting my brush off to taper it so it's a little bit thinner. And so you have that little white space, right? Well, I'm going to fill it. And I'm going to just round out the top a little bit more, like I see fit. You want to make sure that you keep this wet as you're creating this one petal, because you're going to want to have to lift the color out. And if it's dry, you're not going to be able to. So just keep it wet if you need to add more water to it. Okay, so we're going to do the second one. We're going to leave a little bit of space. So at the top, you leave a gap. And then you pull it in and taper it. So lift, lift, lift like that. Okay. So then we go back in and what we do is we combine it more towards the middle like that. But remember, we had to leave that little bit of gap there to make sure that you give it a little bit of highlight and it gives it some texture. And I'm going to round out, because do you see how this is kind of like a straight line here? Well, I don't like that. I want it to be rounded. So I'm going to go back in with my brush and just round it out a little bit. You want this pointed area to be like the thinnest part, right? So it's wider and then it gets thinner. That way, when it gets towards the center, it's really light and airy and it doesn't get bombarded. And that way you can fit all of your petals around it. So you need it to just thin out as it gets closer to the center. Okay, so while this is still wet, again, this is just practice before I add it to the middle. Before it dries, I actually am going to lift the color out with my paper towel like this, because we want to create layers with this one. And then what I do is I go in, actually, let's just add something like this first to this before we move forward. Okay, so let's add what we just did to our center here. The same exact thing. So load your brush up with your magenta, make sure that it's nice and watered. That way you can lift it out easily. And I'm going to add it towards the top. I always like it to have on a slight edge. So what I mean by that is I'm angling it a little bit off to the right here, or you want to do off to the left, so that when you create it, it's going to kind of sit like this way as opposed to just straight up. And I do that because your eye has a tendency of going straight up to, like when things have a straight line to them, your eye gets drawn to it. So it's not always an issue as far as when you're creating these petals like this, but what happens is sometimes if it's completely straight, your eye will just automatically go to this one place as opposed to seeing the whole thing. I know that sounds kind of weird if you're not used to knowing what that means, but straight lines up and down or side to side, like just be aware that because your eye has a tendency to just hit those lines and like see them automatically, it could take away from what really is happening. So you always want to have a slight curve, even if it's minimal, like your eye will still be able to tell. I know that's weird. I know maybe it's hard, but as an artist, you kind of learn those things over time. Okay, so with that being said, I'm going to start at the top here. I always like to, when I'm at the top, I work from out to in. Okay, so what we're going to do is create the side with our brush, pull out, and then lift as we get towards the center. Okay, then I'm going to round it out. Do the same thing, lift, lift, lift. When I say lift, I mean lifting your brush up off the paper so that it thins out. Okay, so we have our first little petal here, but we need to just combine to create a bigger one. So think of it as like creating a heart, right? But you're leaving a small gap in between. Pulling it around and down like this. And I'm going to fill it like this. And then I'm going to make them touch about halfway or maybe even like 2/3 of the way up. We just want that slight sliver of white. Okay, so before it dries, what I want to do now is lift some of that color out. I like to keep color on the edges a little bit for the shadow, like that. So next what I want to do is before it's completely dried, so you don't want it sopping wet for this next step because we're going to be making some more detailed line work in there, and we want it to create a bleed, but we don't want it to just bleed everywhere. And again, that's as you get better, you'll know the fine line between like semi-moist, like really pooled, like a lot of water, and that stuff comes with practice. So just make sure it's not like completely just sopping with water. You just want it to be a little bit moist. What I want to do now is mix my aubergine with my crimson lake. So if you guys have like a purple red, this is what we're going to be doing. So we just want a little bit of a darker color here, using my small brush so I have a little bit more control. Also, I should mention that if you guys have never held a brush, then you get the most control when you're towards more the tip of the brush. Okay. So because I'm creating detail work over a wet surface, I want what I put on top of it to be more, let's just say less wet, right? So because what happens is if you keep adding water to water to water, right, everything just pools and floods. But if you still want to bleed, what happens is you have your bottom layer that's kind of wet, right? Okay, well, I want to add some detail work, but I don't want it to go over and go everywhere. So what I do is to control that, I use less water with every layer. So I make sure that it's more of the pigment from your tube, less watered down. And that'll help you control the spread. Okay, let's see. Still a little bit wet. I know I talked a lot, so maybe it dried a little. So what I'm going to do is just go in a little bit of water. Okay. And sometimes what I do is I use my brush to actually lift water out too if I don't want it to be pooled. And I'm going to start at the middle. And I'm going to pull down a line like this, okay? So then I'm going to, because I know that I want it to be a little bit thinner of a line next time, I'm just going to tap my brush off on my paper towel to make sure that it doesn't have excessive amount of water in it. So this first line kind of taught me that, okay, I need to use less water. If yours bled everywhere, use your paper towel, lift it up. So for example, you can go like this, lift it out a little bit, and go back in. And then we're going to do that with the other side. I'm doing thin lines, but I'm leaving gaps in between. So really just use the tip of your brush. And you can still see how it's bleeding, right? But you still have detail. And that's where that kind of, I want to say, where you get that better idea of balance between water and paint, so you can have more control over it as it's bleeding. Okay, so I want to create more contrast or depth towards the bottom area and this top gap area. So what I'm going to do is load my brush back up, and let's see if I just apply it here. So this area is pretty much dry for me, but I need it to be a little bit more wet. So what I'm going to do is use the tip of my brush, and you can use whatever brush you have right now. And I'm actually going to just pull some of that color down towards that center area to create a little more contrast. The reason I'm doing that is because when things are kind of pushed up against each other, or a lot of times mostly towards the center of things like a flower, there's going to be more contrast towards the bottom as opposed to the top, because the top is technically has more ability to get light hitting it. So you're just going to have more contrast down here as opposed to up here. Okay. So again, just lift some stuff out if you think it's too dark or you want the bleed to be a little bit more subtle. I don't like hard lines, so I really like just bleeding the colors into each other. And hard lines is when you're like, so for example, for this one, this would be a hard line because nothing is bleeding. It's literally sitting on top. Okay, awesome. So now what I want to do, I know, another step, right? Go in with my brush. Mine has dried up in this crack right here. So I'm going to add a little bit of water up just around this area in here, because I want to add some coral or some of that like salmon pink, or if you have like a lighter pink that you can add. While it's still wet, I'm going to add a little bit of water to some of these little lines too. I'm going to go in with my coral, a little less watered down, remember with our layering, and just apply it into the space. Do you notice it just like bleeding down into the lines? Oof, I love that. Love, love, love. This just gives it, again, another dimension, which I absolutely love. I love it when this coral bleeds into that purple. Okay. You can even pull that color down if you want farther. You can bring it outside of the line a little bit. There's so many things that you could do with that. Awesome. So that's your first petal. So we're going to be doing the same thing on the next 3 petals. So just let's keep going. I'm going to explain it a little bit less just because I just explained it in full and we have a time limit. So I want to make sure we don't run out of time. Okay, starting with my magenta. And I'm going to create, so I'm going to leave a gap between these two a little bit. I'm going to pull this one out. And this one's going to be more of a point. Okay. So I'm going to round it out a little bit like this. And pull it in like that. You can always manipulate what you create as you're painting it. So if you need to round something out, make something a little bit longer, it's great because you can do that while you paint. I want this one to kind of round up a little bit. Okay. And I like to just do them one at a time because that way I can create my layering easier. Nothing just dries on me. going in with clear paper. I do not rotate because it's a bad habit, only because you might have, a lot of times we tape our papers down. And I think it's just really beneficial to learn how to paint from different angles. So no, I do not rotate. I do understand people who are starting out that they'll do that. But I do recommend that you try not to. Try to really learn how to paint at different angles. So for example, when I'm at the top here, I paint from out to in, right? And depending on like what's comfortable for you, but like say like I was starting at this angle, right? I painted from in to out for this one. Same with this one, I'll be painting from in to out as I go down. So as you change up your angle, you're going to shift whether you're painting from in to out or out to in. And that stuff again comes with practice. So I do recommend that you don't rotate your paper. It's just, it can become like a bad habit. And if you're not able to do it at one point, like say you have a really big piece, right? You're going to have to like, then you're going to have to learn how to like work around it on the other side and like spin it around. Yeah, it becomes a little bit of a hassle. So I do not recommend doing that. Okay, so I'm going to add my coral to the top here. Watch it bleed in a little bit. Yes. And I want to make sure again that I have a little more contrast down here. So I'm going to mix in my aubergine, kind of add a little bit towards the bottom. Okay, so let's go back to our magenta with our bigger brush. And now what we're gonna do is do our other heart shape right here. Right, notice how I'm working from out or into out again. Okay, so it's a little rounded like this. And then you want to close it off, so kind of come out like you would if you were making a heart. Leave that gap. You never want your petals, again, to be exactly the same either. So if they don't look exactly the same, that's good because, you know, petals have a lot of variation to them, and symmetry is not really our friend with this. It's more of the balance that's our friend. If everything looks alike, it's boring. Okay, so I'm lifting out this color. Remember, I like to leave some of that darker magenta on the edges. Going with your aubergine crimson mix using the smaller brush. And I'm going to start from in to out with this one, creating about 6 or so lines. And remember, you have the controlled because you're using a little bit less water, right? And then just for contrast, let's add a little bit towards the bottom here. And I like to add a little bit more water if I need to, just to get rid of hard lines. Awesome. Okay, let's not forget our coral. Our coral is going to line up this area, our little gap. I'm going to pull it down. Okay. Okay, so here's something in mind. I like to have gaps between my petals, but sometimes like the gaps are a little bit too much for me. Like I like them to touch a little bit more. So for example, this one, I want it to be a little bit closer to this one. So I'm going to take some of my magenta with my large brush. I'm just going to pull this out a little bit and make them touch. See, you can do that stuff. Like once you put something down, doesn't mean it has to stay that way, just so you know. You can always manipulate it a little bit. Okay, the last petal here is going to be one of these, so more pointed. And I'm gonna have him come out here using my magenta. I like to sometimes have texture too in my petal, so as I'm making it, I kind of just do like a weird squiggle like along the edges with the tip to create that texture. And I want this one to kind of be really close to this one as well. So just kind of playing with the shape here a little bit. Okay, paper towel, lift out that color, small brush, grab our aubergine crimson mixture, and create our tiny thin lines. And then creating a little bit more contrast towards the bottom here. Awesome. Okay. And let's not forget our coral. So I use the coral and I add it towards the top and I pull it down. I never like to completely cover up any layer that I create because all those different layers help form dimension. So if I cover up the layers, then really there's no point into my previous work. Okay, I'm gonna add a little bit of an arch right here. You'll notice with some of your petals, like they might look too straight out or like off balanced. Again, as you're working, you can just manipulate them and fix that. Awesome, you guys. So here's our dogwood, and I'm gonna just show you what I like to do is with my smaller brush, I use some of my Celadon green, and I like to group them together, but for the sake of time again, we can only create one. But here I do a grouping, or even you can see in the book, there's a larger grouping. And I like to create these smaller leaves and stems with it. So when you have an opening somewhere, that's where I like to put a stem, kind of coming out and down. Your stems are just kind of, you never want them to be the showpiece unless that's your intention. So always make sure they're light and airy. You never want them to be taking too much of the space up. You never want them to be stocky, like you never want to create a stem like that unless that's kind of what the look you're wanting. Otherwise, it'll really take away from your flower. And then you can create small leaves with this one as well. So awesome. So we have our dogwood. And I'll give you a tip really quickly about when you're grouping these. My suggestion is that you always, until you get better, I would say, you always do a flower at a time. So if I did this one first, it would tell me, okay, well, I have one that I want to go like say over here. And then I can directionalize my petals. So for example, in the book here, you can see how the one that's underneath, the petals are a little bit more direction. So this one is pointing off to the right, right? So the petals on the right side are going to be longer because you can see more of them. But the petals on the left, because it's facing to the right, they're going to be shorter because you can't see them as well because of where it's facing. So just keep that in mind as you're grouping. Also, like this one is layering on top of that one. So it's good to always create ones, like I would do this one first probably, and then I would do this one. And then I would know, okay, I want a third off to the side here to balance it out, right? So like grouping of 3. And this one is going to just peek up behind it to give it that nice balance. So anything that you're wanting to make it look like it's coming from behind, those are always going to be painted after the fact because you're going to need to use the body of the front petal or the front flower to help determine where you're going to put this back flower. And I explain a lot of that stuff in this book, so I know it can be confusing. Okay, so the last thing I want to do is go over the prickly pear. The prickly pear is just a really nice way of kind of getting in touch with like your color mixing, because it has very simple shapes here. So I really love all the different color combinations that you can do. And that's why I said whatever colors you have, honestly, we can use. So let's get into that. Using my larger brush, let's start by creating the body of our prickly pear. Okay, so what I'm going to do is I like to combine certain like multiple colors for the body. And what I mean by that is you can see here how it's a combination of like 2 or 3 different colors. I'll show you how to do that. Okay, so let's start with our emerald green or whatever green you have. When I create the body, I like it to be not so smooth, because if you create something that's super smooth like this, it looks like a balloon, right? It doesn't look super like natural, organic or anything. So I like to just, like I was doing with the flower, kind of go back and forth with the tip of my brush, up and down, just to create more texture within that body. And then I fill it like partially, like that. And then with this section, I water it to make sure it's nice and wet. And then taking my paper towel, I lift that color out a little bit. The reason for that is because I'm going to add in some pink, and you'll see what happens now. Okay, so in this space, I'm going to layer in some pink. Kind of pull it in to that area. And that's why I wanted to lift some of that green out so it wasn't visible when I put the pink down. You never want to have an outline. So for example, if I were to go back in with this, right? Even though I'm using the same color, you can see the outline there because I let it dry. You don't want to let it dry when you're doing more of an outline and filling, because then it just flattens the piece like that. There are times where you're going to want to outline partially, or sometimes it's a decorative element that people do. So they create their piece and then they want to create like thin lines for outlines. That's totally different. But in general, if you outline something, make sure that you fill it quickly so that it doesn't stay and flatten your piece. And also if I go in, say with my pink here, you can kind of see that green behind it, and that got all muddy too. The thing with color combinations, you have to be careful. So this naturally, you can get a really muddy color. So that's why I don't mix them in too much together, but it gives it enough bleed right here. So there's no hard line. Another way you can do this is, what you can do is create, say, your arm or body. And then what you can do is actually, I'm going to use blue this time, because when you layer in colors, you do want to make sure when you layer them that the color sits nicely together. So while this is still wet, I could go in towards like the bottom left here and watch it bleed in like that. So this is a good way if you're combining colors that don't bleed super well together and end up like this. This is a good way. And then this is a good way if the colors do bleed well together. It's all about just like the different way of layering. So I wanted to show you both. Okay, so now that we have our base, let's just play and keep adding our different layers. So we're going to add different arms and things like that. So let's add in an arm here. Okay, like I said, I'm going to fill that partially, and then I'm going to lift this edge out a little bit before it dries. And with that one, I'm gonna go in, let's go in with some of the blue. Oh yeah, that's bleeding really nicely. I really like this one for you guys to learn a lot more about like color mixing and things like that. I think it's really beneficial in that way. So towards the base, I like it to be a little bit deeper. So I'm going to add a little bit more of the purple down here. As you get quicker, you'll be able to do things at a faster speed, and you'll have things bleeding into each other a little bit better, as opposed to just looking like it's sitting right on top. Okay, so let's take some blue. You never want to start out too dark unless you know that you're going to fill it at the same darkness. And what I mean by that is, so for example, this blue, I should have started lighter because you can see this outline here. So you always want to start lighter. Otherwise, you have the potential of just, again, flattening your piece. So what I have to do now is go in and kind of like lift that color out. By what I do is I use the tip of my brush, go back and forth quickly to try to lift some of that color out of the paper. Okay, I'm gonna go in with a little bit of green up here. Right? And maybe a little pink down here. And now what I want to do is make sure that when you're going from green to pink, pink to green, that you do have a nice clean brush. That way it doesn't get all muddy. Okay, and then now what I want to do is for these, you just continue layering. So I have this pink one here. So I'm going to make sure that I leave this wet. So make sure it's nice and wet. So what I want to do is I want to layer a color behind it. So I want to actually layer a purple paddle or arm behind it. So what I do is I don't touch it, and I basically get so close to that back line, and then I pull that in like this. And as I'm going down, I'm leaving a small sliver of white in between, so I don't touch, okay? And what I can do is actually lift some of this pink out so that it's more dry on the edge and lighter. And then what I want to do is grab my purple, less watered down, and go in and barely graze that edge. So what that does is it helps it, that pink come forward and the purple go back. And if you want a little bit more variation in your purple, go in to the right edge, lift some of that color out a little bit so it's not completely one solid color. And then you can kind of play with that as you're adding. Okay, so now what I want to do is you can just keep adding. Honestly, you can create these things as big as you want. You can get to like ones that are huge bunches, right? You don't always have to do them so colorful either. So for example, if with this one, if you wanted to use the same color palette over and over again, you could. And as you get better, what happens is that you can actually create ones that are within the same size. And what I mean by that is a lot of the prickly pears, right? They're kind of bunched up like this. If you've been to the desert, you have a better idea what I'm talking about. But they're just more layered into each other. I like people to learn basic shapes this other way first, because this way you can get really muddy. And if you don't know how to layer in your shapes and kind of control your water, it can get a little dangerous. So once you get better, you can create these groupings as well. And you'll have more control over placement and just water. And you can create more of like a bunch of prickly pears that are within, or petals, which we're in the same grouping here. So there's really all different types of ways that you can do this. And at the end, what I like to do is with a darker color, like really, really, really less watered down, like barely any water in it, just enough to mix. When your piece is dry, I like to go in and just add little marks with the tip of my brush for prickles. And that just really helps kind of tie everything together, that last little detail. Just be careful that you don't like stipple it. And what I mean by that is, so that you don't do this, like people can get a little bit overboard with their prickles and you cover up all your work and it's just a little bit too much, I would say. So you want it a little bit looser, a little more like just implied. Because all you're trying to say is, okay, this is a prickly pear. It has prickles, there's some detail, it ties everything together, but you really want to see those colors underneath. So there we go. Okay, so those are just the basics right there. I think, do we have questions? Let's see. Mercedes, did you see any questions?
I have a couple here.
Okay.
One question is, do you ever rotate your paper as you're painting?
Okay, so yeah, I mentioned that before. I don't rotate it. I think it's important to be able to paint at all angles. So really, really practice going from like in to out or out to in towards the center of whatever you're doing, because it can get really annoying if you try to just rotate your paper every time.
Yeah. Shane asked, do you ever recommend using artificial sources for assisting drying paint if you find it bleeding too much? Maybe fans or heat lamps?
Oh, I honestly have never done that actually. So some people have used, I maybe have used a fan once, like a small fan, but it can actually mess up the drying process. So I like everything to kind of just dry naturally because it can actually make it move a little bit, not at a natural speed. And I don't know, it's weird, but it'll end up a little bit different, I have to say, than if you just let it dry naturally.
Okay. And the last question we have in here is, does your book assume a certain proficiency with watercolors, or is it aimed more at beginners?
It's aimed at beginners, but I also have to say that there's a lot of stuff in there that even if you're, even if like you've done some watercolor, I think it has a lot of like tips over the years that I've learned that I think would be really helpful for you. So, but it is really aimed towards just somebody who's starting out for sure.
Okay. Is there anything else you want to mention about the book or that you've got going on, or about watercolor in general?
Well, okay, let's see. Like I said, my signing's on the 24th of July. The publication is supposed to come out the 20th, so hopefully of July. And then I'm having a virtual launch party on the 21st of July. And so if you guys are part of our mailing list, you can go to my website, Pink Puddle Studio, you subscribe and you'll get all that info. And yeah, so I have kits online, I have kits in my shop, and tutorials on my YouTube and everything. So if you guys enjoyed this, be sure to check that out.
Yeah, another question just came in that asked, does the book list supplies needed?
It
Sounds
does.
like, yeah.
So at the end of the book, it has a resource guide.
Awesome.
Yeah.
Well, thank you so much, Rachel. This was really cool to get to see you in action.
Thank you. I enjoyed it, everybody. So yeah, guys, follow me on Instagram. If you created something today, make sure that you tag me, tag Rocky Nook. Love seeing your paintings, and I'll definitely repost everything. So I hope you learned. Yeah, thank you. I'm glad you guys learned a lot. Thank you for being here.
Yeah, thanks for joining us today. And thanks everyone who tuned in. And this will be up on YouTube tomorrow, so you can catch it again then if you need to.
Awesome.
Thanks everyone. Bye.
Bye.